charged with assassinating my husband. I stood there and watched them assassinate him on TV. And I'm just appalled that they're getting away with this. No charges are being brought against them. When they killed him, they didn't even give me the respect of calling me to tell me my husband was dead. I had to find out through a family member who found out from somebody that called him. No one officially called me to tell me my husband is dead. They've given me no respect whatsoever. And I'm just very irate with the system, the way things are going, the way the laws are. Like my brother-in-law said, this is terrible. Something has to be done.
Can the law be changed in your view?
I believe it can be changed, yes.
Will it?
Yes, it's going to be changed. It's going to be changed. I'm not going to have my husband who died in vain. It's going to be changed.
Brenda, tell us a little bit about how much you miss it. How does the process
This has devastated me tremendously. I waited on him for 14 years of my life. My family, I feel lost. He was 14 years of my life. And I'm just so hurt that just didn't hear anything about him. It just killed him like he was nothing. Just shot him down, cold blood. I mean, and I had to see that. I had to see it on TV. This just devastated my family. We had so many plans that I'm like, what do I do now? You know, the plans that I had with my husband, he's not here to be with me. You know, so I'm just, it's devastated my family, my grandchildren, my children, the whole entire family. We're just at a loss. We just grieve. I hurt every day. I miss him deeply. That's my husband.
and you guys are pursuing a loan?
Yes, but we'll speak more about that. At least we do have to speak to a few other things we'd like to speak to as well.
Tell us your name, please.
Sure, good morning.
Spell it for us.
I'm Lisa Dugard. I'm the director of the Public Defender Association, spelled Lisadaughard. So I'm going to start with the story. Right after the shooting last year, I was contacted by a producer for KUOW who wanted to put together a panel of outside police experts to criticize the police action in this case as being unnecessary. And the folks behind me don't know this. At the time, I urged her not to do that because due to recommendations by the Community Police Commission and others, the Seattle Police Department was in a police position. They were supposed to not be making comments about the circumstances of the shooting before a complete investigation had unfolded. That's a strongly held recommendation by the Community Police Commission and others who want to see full and fair investigations unfold without a leap to judgment. And my point was that SPD could not produce the sort of the missing fact of what was so dangerous, what was the immediate danger posed by Mr. Taylor that called those officers to step forward with long guns, rush up to a car under circumstances that obviously put him and others in danger. Well, there was probably a missing fact, but SPD was not in a position to provide that fact because we and others had recommended that they not try the case in public and allow the investigation to go forward. This producer said to me, with a lot of emotion in her voice, I don't know, she said, it just looked to me like an execution. And I, at the time, urged her to withhold judgment. For months, I, like many others, waited for the missing fact to emerge. What was the threat to the community, to any other individual person that necessitated those officers moving up on that car in what was obviously a very dangerous situation, given their belief that Mr. Taylor was armed and had a past violent history. The remarkable thing to me is that fact never emerged. That fact does not exist. There was no compelling reason that those officers needed to rush up that car with long guns drawn. And that puts us in a completely different situation.
In Washington State, there is nothing that an officer can do that makes his behavior wrong when he chooses to use deadly force. He's sending a message out to our community that even if you comply, you die, and there's nothing nobody's gonna do for you. I'm insulted that he would say that it wasn't even close. Because that's the stern message that he's sending to communities all over Washington state. And that's problematic. So I must ring and sound the alarm to my community to say, you are in danger if he believes that. That we are in danger if he believes that. That's problematic.
He also said that even if the law that you have been a proponent of were to pass, that he would not have made a different decision, even if malice were taken out of the law.
I think that's piggyback. And I think because people know the importance of having this law removed, he wouldn't know what he would do, given the circumstances. Because if the law is changed, the circumstance of the police officer is brought into play. Right now, we can't bring the circumstances of the police officers in play because we can't even convict them or charge them of a crime. We can't even bring anything into play to see if the evidence sustains that we should bring him up on some charges. That's premature for him to say.
Andre, the family also, or the prosecutor also said this would be training to for SBD. He kicked it all back to SBD and said, you guys should talk to SBD about training.
That's passing the buck. He doesn't want to take any accountability. He's been in this role. Now listen, I don't have any personal feelings against Dan Satterburg. I believe that every and anybody can be fair at times in their life. I believe evil people can be. Not that he is, I'm just saying they're going to pull. I believe there are people that have done evil things that can be just to certain people. Maybe their mother, maybe their relatives. So people can be fair, right? I think that in this situation, given the history and 3 decades of 256 people killed in Washington state, not one officer, not one in 3 decades, have been held accountable for his behavior. Under the most egregious circumstances, the John T. Williams case, Dan Burke was found to not to have complied with police procedure. And even in that case, we couldn't bring him up on charges. We couldn't prosecute Dan Burke. In the most egregious case, no one is safe in Washington. Washington has the most restrictive law, the worst laws in this country. Worse than down south, worse than Mississippi and Alabama. Not denigrating them, but worse. Worse, because in this state, the leadership knows something is wrong with this law, yet they have allowed it to stay on the books. So they are complicit in any death.
When he wanted to not file charges, it's our opinion that the amendment was right when you don't really want to come to grips with what actually happened and how that this case could be prosecuted. I think repeatedly throughout Mr. Satterburg's memo, he points out that the officers were in fear for their lives, or potentially in fear for their lives because of Mr. Taylor's criminal history, along with the fact that they saw him holding a gun, or believe they saw him holding a gun about 45 minutes prior to Mr. Taylor's death. I think that highlights something that's extremely important, an important takeaway moving forward, and that's that the officers, the way they chose to approach Mr. Taylor, made a situation in which his death was inevitable. The time they chose to approach Mr. Taylor, officers knew Mr. Taylor's history. They knew they had seen him with a gun 45 minutes prior. There's nothing else described in the memo that offers any additional supporting justification that really explains why Mr. Taylor ultimately was shot 6 to 7 times and killed. I think what's unfortunate is that the officers Miller and Spaulding, chose to run officer long guns on Mr. Taylor and offer conflicting demands. And I think that what we want to come back to is, what should Mr. Taylor have done differently? What could he have done differently, given how the officers chose to arrest Mr. Taylor? In a position where Mr. Taylor was not threatening anyone, where Mr. Taylor was not trying to run away, was not doing anything that created an impression that an arrest was immediately necessary. Officers approached Mr. Taylor and gave commands, conflicting commands. They told him to put his hands in the air, and as the memo and the jury found, Mr. Taylor did in fact put his hands in the air, raising them to that dislocation. Subsequently, officers told Mr. Taylor to get on the ground. As the jury found, and as Mr. Satterburg indicates, Mr. Taylor chose to move towards the ground. There are no other facts other than as Mr. Taylor was getting towards the ground, that his hand moved towards his hip area. At that point, Mr. Taylor was shot. There is no other information that suggests that Mr. Taylor threatened officers, that Mr. Taylor pointed a gun. And I want to come back to the fact that Mr. Taylor did and what he didn't do. As officers approached, Mr. Taylor did not immediately pull a handgun. There wasn't a handgun in his hip, as evidence indicated. He did not say he was not going to follow commands, not scream at officers. Instead, all the evidence that we have, admittedly the evidence is somewhat hazy. We don't have, unfortunately, a video of what actually happened inside the car. The evidence we do have is that Mr. Taylor followed command. The unfortunate reality we're faced with is that right now we have a story that indicates that Mr. Taylor did what he could do to follow commands. That it based solely upon factors that the officers were aware of when they chose to approach Mr. Taylor. In the opinion of the prosecuting attorney's office, there's no prosecution possible. Their opinion based on Mr. Satterburg's opinion is based upon facts that existed prior to the officer's approaching Mr. Taylor. Not based on any observable or definite facts that we can prove that happened after officer's approach. The officers, when choosing to approach Mr. Taylor, created a situation in which they put themselves in what they describe as fear. And we unfortunately, because there is no criminal prosecution, we can't actually fully go in depth and say, was their fear reasonable? That's an important thing that I want everyone to be aware of. The inquest jury found, okay, the officers, not unanimously, but as it was described in the memo, that the officers did say they were in fear. We have no evidence as to whether that fear was reasonable, as to whether Mr. Taylor did things that a reasonable officer should be in fear for their lives. And the fact that as officers approached Mr. Taylor with long guns, choosing when they thought that he was a threat to get closer, not to separate themselves, to escalate the situation, to create a situation in which every action they took made it more likely that Mr. Taylor's life was going to end only seconds later. I think that is very important to point out, and I think it raises important policy concerns moving forward as to if officers are going to conduct an arrest that they believe is in their own words, a high-risk arrest, a dangerous arrest, is it appropriate for officers to act in such a way that makes it more likely that the person they are going to arresting is going to get seriously injured or die? Did they create a situation in which right next to Mr. Taylor was another individual who could have easily been shot as well? And I think it's problematic when you have a police department that finds that there is no violation of policy, that there's nothing wrong with what the officers did, considering that at every step they made it more likely that Mr. Taylor was going to die. And that's ultimately what happened. It was because of the officers' actions. The evidence shows that Mr. Taylor did everything he could to comply with commands. The officers were in complete control over the situation. And exercising that control, they chose to make it more likely that someone was going to be seriously hurt or die. And unfortunately, that is what happened. And today I'm saying before you, and knowing that that's what happened, there is no prosecution in this case. And obviously something that the family finds deeply disappointing.
The prosecutor said it wasn't even close.
Well, we would obviously disagree. I think there is plenty of evidence that indicates that Mr. Taylor did everything he could to comply with commands, that the officers created their own fear, and that based upon that, the officers were not in reasonable fear. And that after the shooting, they acted with malice, showing a thought of malice throughout, and choosing not to render aid for 7 minutes. And I think what is in the prosecutor's memo and what is not in the prosecutor's memo is telling. There is no mention that the officers could have rendered aid and chose not to render aid. There is no mention that it was inappropriate to approach and go hands-on with long guns, something that Officer Spaulding said was a dangerous thing to do in the inquest of his previous shooting. I think this is all relevant, and what is omitted from the prosecutor's memo, I think, is telling, and I think reflects a willingness to not fully come to grips with what happened, and the difficult questions that we have to ask ourselves as a county in light of a shooting such as this.